Imagine trusting someone with your nation's deepest secrets, only to discover they've been selling them to your greatest enemy for nearly 2 decades. This isn't the plot of a Hollywood thriller. This is the true story of the Walker spy ring, the most devastating betrayal in United States Navy history. A family conspiracy that handed the Soviet Union the keys to American naval communications, compromising countless operations, endangering thousands of lives, and threatening the very balance of power during the Cold War's most dangerous years. Tonight, we're diving deep into a story of greed, betrayal, and espionage that reads like fiction but is terrifyingly real. This is the story of how one man's treachery nearly changed the course of history. The date is December 1967. The place is Norfolk, Virginia, home to the largest naval base in the world. Inside a nondescript apartment, a chief warrant officer named John Anthony Walker Jr. sits hunched over stolen classified documents. He's not preparing for a mission. He's not studying for advancement. He's preparing to betray his country in a way that will reverberate for decades. John Walker is about to walk into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and offer his services as a spy. But this isn't a moment of sudden desperation or ideological conversion. This is a calculated decision driven by something far more mundane than political ideology. John Walker is drowning in debt, and he's about to sell out the United States Navy to save himself. To understand how this betrayal became possible, we need to understand who John Walker was. Born in 1937 in Washington, D.C., Walker grew up in a working-class Catholic family. His childhood was unremarkable, his early life devoid of any signs that he would become one of the most damaging spies in American history. In 1955, at the age of 17, Walker enlisted in the United States Navy. It was a common path for young men of his generation, a way to serve their country, gain valuable skills, and build a stable career. Walker seemed to fit right in. He was competent, reliable, and ambitious. Over the next dozen years, he worked his way up through the ranks, eventually earning the position of Chief Warrant Officer and gaining access to some of the Navy's most sensitive communications systems. But beneath the surface of this seemingly successful naval career, John Walker harbored a deeply troubled personal life. His marriage to Barbara Walker was falling apart under the strain of financial problems and his repeated infidelities. Walker lived beyond his means, spending money he didn't have on bars, women, and maintaining an image of success he couldn't afford. By 1967, his debts had mounted to a crisis point. He needed money, and he needed it fast. It was this financial desperation, combined with a fundamental lack of loyalty and moral compass, that led Walker to make his fateful decision. He would sell secrets to the Soviet Union. On a cold day in late 1967, John Walker walked through the doors of the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. It's difficult to overstate how bold and dangerous this move was. The embassy was under constant surveillance by the FBI. Anyone entering was photographed, tracked, and investigated. But Walker was either supremely confident or supremely desperate. He approached Soviet officials and made his pitch. He had access to highly classified naval communications and cryptographic materials, and he was willing to sell. The Soviets, ever opportunistic during the Cold War, listened with great interest. Within hours, they had verified his credentials and confirmed he had access to genuinely valuable intelligence. John Walker had just become a Soviet spy. What made Walker so valuable to the Soviets wasn't just the documents he could steal. It was what he could provide about American cryptography. Walker had worked extensively with the KL-47 cryptographic system, a machine used by the Navy to encrypt communications. Even more critically, he had access to the daily key lists that were used to set these machines. In the world of signals intelligence, this was the holy grail. With these key lists, the Soviets could decrypt American naval communications in near real time. They could read operational orders, track ship movements, understand strategic planning, and penetrate the Navy's supposedly secure communications network. It was a catastrophic breach of security, and it was just the beginning. The Soviets paid Walker handsomely for his treason. His initial payment was several $1,000s, an enormous sum that immediately eased his financial crisis. But more importantly, they established a long-term relationship with him. Walker was given instructions on how to photograph documents, where to make dead drops, and how to communicate securely. The KGB, the Soviet Union's intelligence service, recognized they had recruited an extraordinarily valuable asset. They were patient, methodical, and careful to protect their new spy. Walker, for his part, quickly adapted to his double life. He continued his naval career, appearing to be a dedicated serviceman, while secretly photographing classified materials and passing them to his Soviet handlers. For the next 18 years, John Walker would continue his espionage activities with stunning success. He was never sloppy, never careless enough to raise immediate suspicion. He understood the systems he was betraying intimately, and he knew exactly what the Soviets wanted and how to get it for them. As his career progressed and his access increased, so did the damage he inflicted. But Walker had an even more audacious plan. He wasn't content to spy alone. He would recruit others into his treacherous enterprise, turning espionage into a family business. This expansion would make the Walker spy ring one of the most damaging intelligence compromises in American history. The first person John Walker recruited into his spy ring was his old Navy friend, Chief Radioman Jerry Alfred Whitworth. Walker and Whitworth had served together in the early 1960s, and Walker knew that Whitworth had similar access to classified communications. In 1975, Walker approached Whitworth with his proposition. The pitch was simple: easy money for copying documents that Whitworth already had access to as part of his regular duties. The risk seemed minimal, and the payoff was substantial. Whitworth, facing his own financial pressures and perhaps swayed by Walker's apparent success, agreed. This recruitment exponentially increased the volume and value of intelligence flowing to the Soviet Union. Jerry Whitworth would prove to be an exceptionally productive spy. He served on multiple ships and shore installations throughout his career, each posting giving him access to different cryptographic materials and communications. He was meticulous in his espionage work, photographing thousands of pages of classified documents. Between 1975 and 1985, Whitworth provided the Soviets with an enormous quantity of highly sensitive material. His contributions to the Walker spy ring were so significant that some intelligence analysts later concluded that Whitworth's access was even more damaging than Walker's own. The two men met periodically for Walker to collect the materials Whitworth had stolen, which Walker would then pass to the Soviets. For this service, Whitworth was paid over $300,000 over the course of a decade. But John Walker wasn't finished recruiting. In an almost unbelievable expansion of his spy ring, he next approached his own son, Michael Walker. Michael had followed his father into the Navy, and by the early 1980s was serving as a yeoman on the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz. John Walker saw an opportunity. He pressured his son to join the espionage operation, presenting it as a way to make money and help the family. Michael, young and influenced by his father's persuasion, reluctantly agreed. Beginning in 1982, Michael Walker began stealing classified documents from the USS Nimitz and passing them to his father. The betrayal had now become multi-generational, a family legacy of treason. The inclusion of Michael Walker in the spy ring demonstrated John Walker's complete lack of moral boundaries. He was willing to endanger his own son, to make him a traitor and put him at risk of execution or life imprisonment for money. Michael later testified that he was uncomfortable with the espionage and that his father had pressured him into it. But regardless of the circumstances, Michael Walker was now complicit in one of the worst security breaches in naval history. The documents he stole from the USS Nimitz included operational plans, intelligence reports, and cryptographic materials. Every piece of paper he photographed and passed to his father represented another advantage given to the Soviet Union. The final member of the Walker spy ring was John's older brother, Arthur Walker. Arthur was a retired Navy lieutenant commander who was working as a defense contractor with access to classified information. In 1980, John approached Arthur about joining the espionage operation. Arthur, who apparently idolized his younger brother and was experiencing financial difficulties of his own, agreed. Arthur's access was more limited than the others, but he still provided classified documents related to Navy operations and systems. His participation rounded out a spy ring that now included 4 members across 2 generations of the Walker family. So what exactly were the Walkers providing to the Soviet Union, and why was it so damaging? The answer lies in understanding the nature of Cold War naval operations and the critical importance of secure communications. During the Cold War, the United States Navy was engaged in a constant cat-and-mouse game with the Soviet Navy. American submarines tracked Soviet submarines. Surface ships monitored each other's movements. Both sides conducted intelligence gathering operations in sensitive waters. The Navy's ability to communicate securely was absolutely essential to these operations. If the Soviets could read American naval communications, they would know where American ships were, what they were doing, and what they planned to do next. This was precisely what the Walker spy ring gave them. The cryptographic materials provided by the Walker ring allowed Soviet intelligence to decrypt enormous volumes of American naval communications. They could read messages between ships, between shore commands and vessels at sea, between different naval installations. They gained insight into American naval doctrine, tactics, and capabilities. They learned about weaknesses in American systems and ships. Perhaps most critically, they could track the movements of American nuclear submarines, the stealthiest and most powerful weapons in the Navy's arsenal. Every message decrypted was another small victory for the Soviet Union, another incremental advantage in the global struggle between the superpowers. The damage extended beyond immediate tactical intelligence. The Soviets used the information provided by the Walker ring to improve their own systems and to develop countermeasures against American capabilities. They learned how American sonar systems worked and developed quieter submarines to evade detection. They studied American electronic warfare capabilities and created jamming systems to counter them. They analyzed American naval tactics and developed strategies to defeat them. The Walker spy ring wasn't just providing snapshots of current operations. It was giving the Soviets a comprehensive education in American naval capabilities, allowing them to close the technological and tactical gap that had favored the United States. Some specific incidents illustrate the real-world consequences of this betrayal. During the 1980s, American submarines conducting intelligence-gathering missions near Soviet waters found themselves detected and tracked far more often than expected. Soviet anti-submarine warfare capabilities seemed to have improved dramatically. What the Americans didn't know was that the Soviets were reading their communications, allowing them to anticipate where American submarines would be and when. In other instances, American naval exercises were shadowed by Soviet vessels that seemed to know exactly where to position themselves. Operational security measures that should have kept American movements secret were rendered useless because the Soviets had the keys to decrypt the communications. The full extent of the damage may never be fully known, but senior intelligence officials who reviewed the Walker case later provided chilling assessments. One former Secretary of Defense called it one of the most damaging espionage cases in American history. Senior intelligence analysts concluded that the Walker ring had compromised virtually every naval operation and movement during the years they were active. Some estimates suggested that in a hypothetical war between the United States and Soviet Union during this period, the intelligence advantage given to the Soviets by the Walker ring could have resulted in the loss of multiple American ships and thousands of American lives. This wasn't abstract theoretical damage. This was concrete, measurable harm to American national security. But how did the Walker spy ring operate for so long without detection? How did John Walker and his accomplices evade the Navy's security apparatus for nearly 2 decades? The answer is a combination of factors, some related to Walker's own skill and caution, others to systemic failures in security procedures. Walker was careful to avoid patterns that might attract attention. He varied his methods of document theft, used sophisticated photography equipment to copy materials quickly, and maintained his cover as a dedicated Navy professional. He didn't live ostentatiously, didn't suddenly display wealth that would be inconsistent with his salary. He was patient and methodical, never rushing or taking unnecessary risks. The Navy's security systems also had significant weaknesses that Walker exploited. Background checks were less thorough than they would later become. Polygraph examinations were not routinely administered to personnel with cryptographic access. Physical security for classified materials, while strict in theory, had gaps in practice. Walker worked in environments where he had legitimate access to the materials he was stealing, making his theft less noticeable. He could justify being in secure spaces, handling classified documents, and working with cryptographic equipment because these were his assigned duties. He wasn't breaking into safes or sneaking into restricted areas. He was stealing materials he was supposed to be working with, making detection much more difficult. Additionally, the sheer volume of classified material in the Navy system worked in Walker's favor. Thousands of people had access to classified information at various levels. Millions of documents were created, transmitted, and stored. Tracking individual documents or noticing when specific items went missing was extraordinarily difficult. Walker took advantage of this complexity, stealing materials that he could plausibly explain handling if questioned, and ensuring that no single theft was obvious enough to trigger alarms. His approach was to steal consistently, but never excessively, to blend his espionage into the normal course of his duties. But perhaps the most important factor in Walker's long run of success was simple luck combined with the FBI's limited resources for counterintelligence during much of this period. The FBI and Navy investigative services were not looking for Walker specifically because they had no reason to suspect him. He had never been caught engaging in suspicious behavior. He had no known contacts with Soviet officials after his initial recruitment. His financial situation, while once desperate, had stabilized sufficiently that he wasn't displaying the kind of unexplained wealth that might trigger suspicion. Without specific leads pointing to Walker, investigators had little reason to focus on him among the thousands of Navy personnel with classified access. However, there were warning signs that, in retrospect, should have been noticed. Barbara Walker, John's ex-wife, had become aware of his espionage activities during their marriage. She confronted him about it, and he admitted to being a spy. But for years, she remained silent, caught between fear, residual loyalty, and uncertainty about what to do. It wasn't until 1984, years after their divorce and following a particularly bitter dispute over finances, that Barbara Walker finally decided to turn her ex-husband in. In November 1984, she contacted the FBI and told them that John Walker was a Soviet spy. This single act of conscience, delayed though it was, would bring down the entire Walker spy ring. The FBI initially treated Barbara Walker's allegations with caution. Ex-spouses making accusations against each other are not uncommon, and investigators needed to verify her claims before taking action. But as they began to investigate, they quickly realized that her information was credible and detailed. She knew about the spy ring's operations, about the dead drops, about the meetings with Soviet handlers. The FBI opened a full investigation code named Operation Windflyer. Agents began surveilling John Walker, monitoring his movements, tracking his communications, and building a case. They needed to catch him in the act of espionage to ensure a solid prosecution. By early 1985, John Walker had retired from the Navy but continued his espionage activities, now acting primarily as a coordinator between the Soviet handlers and the active members of his spy ring, particularly his son Michael and Jerry Whitworth. The FBI surveillance teams tracked him as he prepared for a scheduled meeting with his Soviet contacts. On May 20, 1985, FBI agents followed Walker as he drove to a location near Washington, D.C. to make a delivery to his Soviet handlers. The agents watched as Walker placed a bag containing classified documents at a pre-arranged dead drop site. Shortly after, they arrested him. John Walker's 18-year career as a Soviet spy had finally come to an end. The arrest of John Walker triggered a rapid series of additional arrests. Within days, FBI agents arrested Michael Walker aboard the USS Nimitz. They arrested Arthur Walker at his home in Virginia. A massive manhunt was launched for Jerry Whitworth, who was eventually located and arrested in California. All 4 members of the Walker spy ring were now in custody, facing charges of espionage, conspiracy, and related offenses. The investigation expanded as agents searched homes, offices, and storage units, uncovering mountains of evidence documenting nearly 2 decades of betrayal. The legal proceedings that followed were among the most significant espionage trials in American history. John Walker, faced with overwhelming evidence and hoping to secure a lighter sentence for his son Michael, agreed to cooperate with investigators. He pled guilty to espionage charges and provided extensive debriefings about his activities, his methods, and the information he had provided to the Soviets. His cooperation helped investigators understand the full scope of the damage and potentially identify security weaknesses that needed to be addressed. In exchange for his cooperation and his testimony against Jerry Whitworth, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. In November 1985, John Walker was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. Michael Walker, portrayed by his defense as a young man manipulated by his father, also pled guilty. The prosecution acknowledged that Michael had been pressured into the spy ring and had been a less willing participant than the others. Taking this into account, along with his father's cooperation, Michael Walker received a 25-year sentence. He would eventually be released from prison in 2000 after serving 15 years. Arthur Walker went to trial, was convicted, and received a life sentence. He maintained that his contributions to the spy ring were minimal, but the court found him guilty of espionage nonetheless. Arthur Walker died in federal prison in 2014. The most contentious trial was that of Jerry Whitworth. Unlike the others, Whitworth refused to plead guilty and insisted on going to trial. His defense argued that while he had provided classified information to John Walker, he didn't know it was being given to the Soviets and hadn't intended to harm the United States. This defense was undermined by the enormous quantities of highly classified material he had stolen and the substantial payments he had received. In July 1986, after a lengthy trial, Jerry Whitworth was convicted on multiple counts of espionage. The prosecution had sought the death penalty, but the jury instead recommended life in prison. Whitworth was sentenced to 365 years in prison with no possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated to this day. The exposure of the Walker spy ring sent shockwaves through the United States Navy and the broader intelligence community. Immediate steps were taken to assess the damage and to change the compromised cryptographic systems. Every code, cipher, and key list that the Walkers might have compromised had to be assumed to be known by the Soviets. The Navy undertook a massive and expensive effort to replace cryptographic equipment, change communications procedures, and enhance security protocols. The financial cost alone ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. But the cost to national security, to operational effectiveness, and to the lives potentially endangered was incalculable. Congressional hearings were held to investigate how the Walker spy ring had operated undetected for so long and what systemic failures had allowed it to happen. The hearings revealed significant weaknesses in security procedures, background investigations, and counterintelligence operations. Reforms were implemented across the military and intelligence services. Security clearance procedures were tightened. More extensive background checks became standard. Polygraph examinations were expanded. Physical security for classified materials was enhanced. Procedures for tracking and controlling classified documents were improved. The goal was to ensure that such a devastating breach could never happen again. But beyond the institutional reforms, the Walker case forced a broader reckoning with the human element of security. All the technology, all the procedures, all the regulations in the world cannot protect against a trusted insider who decides to betray that trust. John Walker wasn't a disillusioned ideologue or a coerced victim. He was a volunteer spy motivated by greed. He exploited the trust placed in him as a career naval officer to inflict enormous damage on the country he had sworn to serve. The case highlighted the critical importance of personnel security, of understanding the motivations and vulnerabilities of those granted access to sensitive information, and of maintaining vigilance even among long-serving and apparently loyal personnel. The Walker spy ring also had significant impacts on Soviet-American relations and Cold War dynamics. When Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was informed about the case, he reportedly expressed concern that it might damage the improving relationship between the superpowers in the mid-1980s. The Soviets never publicly acknowledged their relationship with Walker or confirmed the intelligence they received, but Western intelligence services had no doubt about the connection. The case served as a stark reminder that despite the warming of relations and talk of glasnost and perestroika, the fundamental intelligence competition between the United States and Soviet Union remained intense and consequential. In the years since the Walker case, there has been extensive analysis and debate about the full extent of the damage. Some intelligence officials have argued that the case was even more damaging than publicly acknowledged, that the compromise of naval communications had put American forces at risk in ways that remain classified. Others have suggested that while the damage was serious, American naval superiority was never truly threatened, and that the Soviets were unable to fully exploit the intelligence advantage Walker provided. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, but there is no doubt that the Walker spy ring represents one of the darkest chapters in American naval history. John Walker himself showed remarkably little remorse for his actions. In prison interviews over the years, he minimized the damage he caused and portrayed himself as simply a man who got caught up in circumstances. He claimed he never intended to harm anyone, and that he was just trying to solve his financial problems. This self-serving narrative ignored the reality that his actions endangered countless American service members, compromised critical military operations, and gave a strategic advantage to America's primary adversary during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. Walker died in federal prison in August 2014 at the age of 77, having served nearly 30 years of his life sentence. The story of the Walker spy ring offers lessons that remain relevant today. In an era of even more sophisticated technology and even more valuable information, the insider threat remains one of the most challenging security problems facing governments and organizations. The Walker case demonstrates that motivation for betrayal can be as simple as greed, that trusted insiders with legitimate access can cause catastrophic damage, and that security systems must account for the human element as much as the technical element. It shows the importance of counterintelligence, of taking seriously tips and leads even when they come from unconventional sources, and of maintaining vigilance over long periods. The case also illustrates the long-term consequences of espionage. The damage Walker caused didn't end when he was arrested. The Soviets retained the intelligence they had gained. They used it to develop their own systems and capabilities. They gained insights into American naval operations that influenced their strategic planning for years. Even after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, the legacy of the Walker spy ring remained. The case studies continue to be taught in intelligence training programs as an example of the devastating impact a single well-placed spy can have. For the United States Navy, the Walker spy ring remains a painful memory and a cautionary tale. It represents a betrayal of trust, a violation of the core values of honor, courage, and commitment that define naval service. Every sailor who served during the Walker era had to confront the reality that their communications, their movements, their plans might have been known to the enemy because of one man's greed. The institutional hurt ran deep and drove reforms that continue to shape Navy security practices today. The service learned hard lessons about the need for robust security measures, about the importance of protecting classified information, and about the critical necessity of identifying and stopping insider threats before they can cause irreparable harm. The families of those involved in the Walker spy ring also paid a terrible price. Barbara Walker, who finally turned in her ex-husband, lived with the knowledge that she had remained silent for years when she could have stopped him earlier. Michael Walker served 15 years in prison for crimes he committed as a young man under his father's influence. Arthur Walker died behind bars. The extended family dealt with the shame and stigma of being associated with one of the worst cases of treason in American history. The ripples of John Walker's betrayal extended far beyond his own life, damaging everyone connected to him. In the broader context of Cold War espionage, the Walker spy ring stands alongside other notorious cases like those of Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen as examples of devastating insider betrayals. What made the Walker case unique was its duration, the number of people involved, and the systematic nature of the compromise. This wasn't a single leak or a short-term operation. This was a sustained, organized effort spanning nearly 2 decades and involving multiple individuals across a family network. The methodical way the ring operated, the volume of material they provided, and the critical nature of the communications they compromised made it one of the most damaging espionage cases in American history. Today, the story of the Walker spy ring is taught in military academies, intelligence schools, and security training programs as a case study in the insider threat. Students learn about the warning signs that were missed, the security failures that enabled the espionage, and the massive damage that resulted. They study the investigative techniques that eventually brought Walker down, and the reforms that were implemented in response. The case serves as a reminder that security is not just about technology or procedures, but about people, their motivations, their vulnerabilities, and their choices. It demonstrates that trust must be earned and verified, and that even the most trusted individuals must be subject to appropriate oversight and security measures. The Walker case also prompts reflection on the nature of loyalty and service. John Walker took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. He wore the uniform of the United States Navy. He was entrusted with some of the nation's most sensitive secrets, and he betrayed all of it for money. His actions stand in stark contrast to the vast majority of service members who honor their oaths, who serve with integrity, and who would never dream of betraying their country. The Walker case is a reminder that such individuals exist, that the insider threat is real, and that constant vigilance is necessary to protect against it. In the final analysis, the Walker spy ring represents one of the most significant security failures in American military history. It demonstrates how a single individual with access, opportunity, and motivation can cause damage that echoes for decades. It shows the critical importance of security culture, of taking personnel security seriously, of investigating tips and leads, and of implementing robust counterintelligence measures. Most fundamentally, it reminds us that the most sophisticated security systems in the world can be undermined by human weakness, by greed, by betrayal. The technology and procedures can only do so much. In the end, security depends on the integrity and loyalty of the people entrusted with our nation's secrets. The legacy of the Walker spy ring continues to influence American military and intelligence operations today. The reforms implemented in response to the case, the lessons learned from the investigation, and the cautionary tale of what can happen when an insider goes bad all remain relevant. Every person who receives a security clearance today benefits from the enhanced procedures and security measures that resulted from the Walker case. Every counterintelligence professional who works to identify and stop insider threats draws on the lessons of this case. The Walker spy ring will never be forgotten because the damage it caused was too great and the lessons it teaches are too important. As we conclude this examination of the Walker spy ring, we're left with sobering reflections on trust, betrayal, and the price of vigilance. John Walker's betrayal wasn't the result of ideology or coercion. It was a choice, a decision to place personal financial gain above duty, honor, and country. That choice resulted in one of the most damaging compromises of American national security in history. It endangered lives, compromised operations, and gave America's adversary a strategic advantage during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. The full extent of the damage may never be completely known, but its significance is beyond question. This is the story of the Walker spy ring, the Navy's worst betrayal, a family's conspiracy against their own country, and a reminder that the insider threat remains one of the most challenging and consequential security problems we face. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of the darkest chapters of American naval history.